I'll never forget the expression on Susan Kensington's face the day she marched into that courtroom. Chin high, hair teased to perfection, and a designer bag swinging like a trophy at her side. She gripped her lawsuit papers as though they were a golden ticket. She was already picturing the smug speech she would deliver at the next HOA meeting. In her mind, this was the day. She'd finally put me in my place. The woman who had made my life a living nightmare for months was certain this was her big moment. What she didn't know was that I had a little surprise of my own. I had documents sitting neatly inside my briefcase that would wipe that victorious grin right off her face. It was evidence so ironic and completely unbelievable that even I had trouble accepting it. Susan Kensington, the self-proclaimed Queen of Whispering Pines, HOA president, and my personal tormentor, had unknowingly built part of her house on my land. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let's rewind to where it all began, 6 months earlier. That was when I made the single biggest mistake of my entire life. I bought a house and moved directly into her tightly controlled kingdom. The realtor had described it as a rare opportunity in the historic Whispering Pines subdivision. The corner lot on Cedar Point Road and River Oaks Boulevard had been sitting unsold for almost a year. I really should have taken that as a massive warning sign. But the price was fair, and the commute to work was ideal. The 1960s ranch-style house needed some work, sure, but it had good bones. What could possibly go wrong? I got my terrifying answer the very next morning. While I was still unpacking heavy boxes in my living room, I heard a sharp, rapid knock at my front door. I opened it to find a woman in her early 50s standing on my porch like a soldier on inspection duty. She wore pressed khakis and a crisp white button-down embroidered with the official HOA logo. She clutched a heavy clipboard in her hand like a weapon. "I am Susan Kensington, president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association," she announced without so much as a polite hello. "We need to talk about several violations I have already noticed." I hadn't even finished unpacking, and apparently I was already a huge problem. She listed them off with brutal efficiency. She spoke like someone who had done this 1,000 times before. My moving truck had been parked on the street longer than the permitted 2 hours. My lawn was a 1/4 inch above regulation height. And the mailbox, the very one that came with the house, was not an approved model. She handed me a neat little stack of violation notices totaling $300 in steep fines. Then she flashed a smile so tight it could have easily cracked glass. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she said before striding away. That is when I noticed her house sat directly behind mine. From that day on, Susan made it her personal mission to make my life totally miserable. She'll find me just for the color of my garden hose. She measured the distance between my trash cans with a tape. She acted like a detective at an active crime scene. When I installed new blinds in my living room, she knocked on my door the next morning. She informed me that Off-White was not HOA approved. According to her strict rules, only pure white was allowed. The ultimate breaking point came when I received a certified letter. It demanded 6 months of back HOA dues plus heavy late fees. It was a staggering total of $2,400. According to her, the previous owner had stopped paying. And now that I was the new owner, the massive debt was suddenly mine. When I tried to explain I would check my closing documents, she quickly cut me off. Her arms were folded tightly like a judge passing a harsh sentence. "There's nothing to review," she said coldly. "Every homeowner in Whispering Pines pays HOA dues. It is not optional. If you don't comply immediately, I will place a legal lien on your property." That night, I cleared my dining room table. I spread out every single document from closing. I looked at the deed, the survey, the title report, and everything I had barely skimmed at the time. That is when I spotted something very odd. Attached securely to the deed was a land lease agreement dated July 15, 1973. It stated that my property included not just the corner lot I had recently purchased. It also included a lease strip of land that extended well beyond the surveyed property line. The lease had been paid in full for 99 years. Curious, I dove into the county's online records. What I found nearly knocked the wind straight out of me. That lease strip of land wasn't just some random piece of dirt. It included a highly significant portion of Susan Kensington's backyard. The next morning, I went straight to the county recorder's office. Walter, an older clerk with decades of experience, helped me piece it all together. "I remember this mess," he said, squinting. Back in the 70s, the developer used these long-term land leases to finance Whispering Pines, then went bankrupt. Parcels got sold off, piece by piece. Nobody ever cleaned up the records. And according to those official records, when Susan's house was built in 1991, it was constructed partially on land covered by my lease. 20 feet of her lot was on my leased property. So that meant part of her actual house was technically sitting on my leased land. I immediately hired a brilliant real estate attorney named Richard Sterling, who spent 2 weeks combing through everything. When he finally called me into his office, his words were both surreal and deeply satisfying. "The lease is perfectly valid," Richard said, tapping the papers. "Legally, she's been trespassing. She has been trespassing for more than 30 years. You could demand rent or technically force her to remove the encroaching structure. I had no intention of tearing down someone's actual house, but I sure as hell wasn't going to keep letting Susan bully me." When she sent another threatening letter demanding $3,000 in HOA dues and penalties, I decided it was time to hit back. Richard drafted a strong letter explaining that my property was completely exempt from HOA membership due to the lease agreement. We also casually mentioned a boundary issue that would require resolution. Susan's response was almost instant. She stormed up to my porch the very next day. Her face was bright red, and she was clutching the letter like it had personally insulted her entire family. "How dare you try to weasel out of your obligations with some made-up technicality?" she shouted furiously. "I don't care what some lazy lawyer says." And just like that, the battle lines were drawn. "You live in Whispering Pines, so you pay dues like everyone else," Susan snapped. Her voice was as sharp as broken glass. I stayed perfectly calm, which honestly only made her that much angrier. "Susan," I said evenly, "I suggest you have your attorney review the documents we referenced. This isn't a loophole or some made-up trick. It is a legal reality. We will see about that," she spat. Her face was completely flushed with rage. "I am filing a lawsuit first thing Monday morning. You will pay those dues plus every single legal fee it costs me to teach you a lesson." True to her word, the following week I was formally served with a massive lawsuit. Susan was suing me for unpaid HOA dues, late fees, legal costs, and something utterly ridiculous. She was suing for intentional infliction of emotional distress on the HOA board. She demanded over $10,000. Richard and I sat down to prepare our response carefully. We agreed not to show all of our cards at once. Our official reply simply restated that my property was exempt from HOA membership. We respectfully asked the court for a dismissal of all claims. But along with that, we filed a devastating counterclaim. We sued for trespassing and unjust enrichment for the unauthorized use of my leased land. We attached the undeniable property documents. The moment Susan's lawyer, a young and eager attorney named Kevin Bennett, received our counterclaim, the entire tone shifted. 2 days later, Richard got a phone call and put it on speaker. "I don't think my client fully understood the situation," Kevin said carefully over the phone. "Perhaps we could resolve this without further litigation." But Susan was Susan, and she refused to back down. At the settlement conference, she sat across from me with her arms folded tight. She kept an icy glare fixed on my face, as if sheer willpower could make her massive property problem just disappear. "This is absolutely ridiculous," she snapped loudly. "I have lived in that house for 20 years. You can't just waltz in here with some ancient piece of paper and claim I'm on your land." Richard calmly spread out the hard evidence on the large table. He presented the original deed, the lease agreement, the survey maps, and the county records. Kevin's face drained of color completely. He flipped through each page with growing dread. "Mrs. Kensington," he said quietly, "these documents appear to be legitimate. Your house is partially built on land leased to Mr. Hayes. Then the documents are wrong." Susan barked, slamming her hand aggressively on the table. "This is fraud." The mediator, a retired judge named Martha Higgins, spent nearly an hour reviewing everything. Finally, she peered at Susan over her reading glasses. "Mrs. Kensington," she said firmly, "I've seen many property disputes. These documents are authentic, properly recorded, and legally binding. You should seriously consider settling," she advised. But Susan wasn't interested in logic or reason. She stormed out of the room, loudly declaring she would see me in court. Kevin quickly followed. He was clearly trying to talk her down. 3 months later, the epic showdown finally came. Susan swept into the courtroom like an arrogant queen entering her grand throne room. Her best suit was pressed to perfection, and her HOA president pin glinted in the bright fluorescent lights. She took her seat at the plaintiff's table, shuffling her papers with a very tight jaw. She kept shooting me dagger-like looks. Judge Charles Montgomery, a known-sense man in his 60s, read through the thick case file with growing interest. Susan's eager attorney went first. He argued that I was just a delinquent homeowner trying to avoid my responsibilities through weird technicalities. Then Richard stood up, calm and steady, and began to expertly lay out our case. He showed how my property predated the HOA entirely. He proved how the lease agreement explicitly exempted it from any HOA obligations. And then, finally, he dropped the massive, undeniable bomb. Susan's house was sitting partially on my leased land. The judge leaned forward, closely examining the survey maps and comparing them to satellite images on his laptop. The courtroom was totally silent. The room was completely still, except for the quiet shuffle of papers. "Let me make sure I understand this," Judge Montgomery said slowly. "Mrs. Kensington's house is partially built on leased land. The very house from which she conducts her HOA business is built on land leased to Mr. Hayes." "That is correct, Your Honor," Richard replied smoothly. The judge slowly turned his attention to Susan. "Mrs. Kensington, were you actively aware of this when you purchased your home?" Susan's complexion shifted from an angry red to bone white. "No, Your Honor. This is the first I'm hearing of it. And yet you have been aggressively collecting HOA dues and issuing fines to neighboring properties for 30 years, the judge said sternly. "The HOA was established legally," Susan protested weakly. "We have proper documentation." "Documentation," the judge replied evenly. "That does not supersede prior property rights." For 10 long minutes, Judge Montgomery reviewed every single legal detail. Then he set the file down heavily and gave his final ruling. "I find in favor of the defendant, Mr. Hayes. His property is clearly exempt from HOA membership based on pre-existing agreements. The plaintiff's claims are dismissed with prejudice." But the judge wasn't finished yet. "Furthermore," he continued, "regarding the counterclaim, I find that Mrs. Kensington has been unjustly enriched. She has been enriched by the unauthorized use of the defendant's leased land. While I won't order the removal of the structure due to the time elapsed, I am ordering that Mrs. Kensington pay rent. She must pay fair market rent for this land." He calculated the amount based on current land values and square footage. "Mrs. Kensington, you are ordered to pay Mr. Hayes back rent. You will pay $18,000 in back rent for the past 3 years, plus $400 per month going forward, with annual adjustments for inflation." Susan shot up from her chair. She stood up so fast, her chair clattered backward. "This is outrageous," she shouted in open court. "I am not paying rent for my own property." "It is not your property, Mrs. Kensington," the judge said. He spoke sharply. and I would suggest you carefully watch your tone in my courtroom. You are incredibly fortunate Mr. Hayes isn't seeking to have your house torn down to the ground today." Then he added one more devastating thing. "It has also come to my attention during this proceeding that you have been actively harassing Mr. Hayes with frivolous petty fines and violations. That stops immediately. Any further harassment will be considered a direct violation of this court's order and handled accordingly." Susan's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Her lawyer was already packing up his briefcase with the weary resignation of a man who had lost the battle before it even began. As I left the courtroom, I heard her shrill voice echoing down the hall. "Emergency board meeting tonight. No, it cannot wait until Tuesday." 2 weeks later, 2 very important letters arrived in my mail. The first contained a certified check for $18,000. It also contained a signed rental agreement for the land. The second came directly from the Whispering Pines HOA board. It announced that Susan Kensington had resigned as president, effective immediately. Neighbors told me the board had forcefully voted her out. They did it after learning about the humiliating lawsuit and the massive embarrassment she had brought on the HOA. Her iron-fisted rule was over. The absolute final twist came 6 months later when a large moving truck pulled into her driveway. She simply couldn't stand living next to me and paying me rent each month. She couldn't stand being reminded daily of her epic defeat. She sold the house at a very steep loss, forced to legally disclose the land lease to every potential buyer. The new owners are the Millers. They are a young couple who pay their lease fee promptly and are genuinely good neighbors. They even invited me to their housewarming party. As for Susan, she moved to a new neighborhood across town. She moved to one without an HOA. Every January, when that sweet rent check arrives, I can't help but remember the day Susan Kensington learned the absolute hardest way possible. Sometimes, the person you constantly try to push around just might legally own the ground beneath your feet.